Alright, so in this video I was going to talk about two new releases this week, but I just saw Charlie Kaufman's new movie, I'm Thinking of Anything's on Netflix, and I'm kind of dying to talk about it, I guess, or to kind of put the feelings together kind of in real time, I guess, as it were. I know some people don't a lot of people tend to care more for people talking about movies that kind of have a pre-planned thing of what they're going to say, and I mean, I know what I want to talk about, but I just feel like it's going to be kind of a journey, just because of the kind of movie it is, and because we know with the way Charlie Kaufman is, with this being his next directorial effort after Synecdoche, New York, and Anomalisa, and I haven't talked about Synecdoche, New York on camera because I don't know if I even could, but I did praise Anomalisa on this channel when it came out back in 2015. So I'm going to attempt to talk about this. I think there is a huge advantage, not entirely, but there is a huge advantage somewhat going into this having read the book. So you at least have, like, if you do that, then you have kind of an idea of what's going on, but Kaufman definitely sort of took his own way also, because the great thing about this is that this is an example of Kaufman doing, like, just having fun with the adaptation process in general, which we know he has done before. There's literally a whole movie about it, but in this particular case, what I love that he did was, and I can see this probably being infuriating to some people depending on where they're coming from, but typically there's like two different kinds of adaptation. Like if you're adapting, specifically if you're adapting a book, where you can pretty much adapt it as it is, like exactly as the story is, more often than not, word for word, or at least really close to it, and the events are the same, and so on. And just kind of a direct adaptation. Or there's the people that take a book and they get like an inspiration from it, and it's maybe like a loose telling of the story, but more or less the writer or the director's like own vision and own story and everything, and that was just kind of a slight foundation, like a jumping off point. And with those two kinds of adaptation, in this movie Kaufman uses both of them. Like, it's half a direct adaptation, half Kaufman doing whatever the fuck he wants to do. Which actually makes perfect sense, because when you look into it, the author of the book had said that he made the ending, like, intentionally vague, and it's, like, it's a whole up-to-your interpretation thing. The book is almost pretty direct about exactly what's going on, much more so than the movie is, but with the idea of the author saying, it's up to your own interpretation, I do love the fact that Kaufman seemed to take that and just say, okay, I'm going to completely interpret like the entire last half of this as my own thing then. And that's basically what we have. But it is a meshing of the two styles of adaptation, so that's... While I don't know if it completely works, just that alone I really appreciate, like, the approach, because it's just so interesting, and this is, of course, a person that we would expect to take an approach like this, one that's as sort of off the wall as possible. Because I did wonder, like, when I had heard that Charlie Kaufman's next movie was him adapting a book, it was like, I wonder how exactly that was going to go, because I couldn't really imagine Charlie Kaufman reading a whole book and saying, "Oh, I'm just going to do this person's exact vision." Like, there's no way, Kaufman's mind would not somehow find its way into this in magnificent fashion. So there's that. And talking about it being sort of up for interpretation and just sort of being its own thing and going in its own different directions, I kind of also had a feeling of, like, not exactly what to expect, but like with the mindset of which to go into it. Because I saw a very early review, and I don't really read the reviews beforehand, but I saw just like one line, and this one line had compared it to Mulholland Drive. And there's definitely... I feel like there's so much Kaufman in the movie that I feel like the book is much more Lynch than the movie is. But I suppose you can get that vibe from both of them, but I definitely kind of got that vibe much more from the book, and the movie is definitely a Kaufman creation. So as far as like the style of it from the start, like I was saying about it, it could probably infuriate people. Like the fact that this is on Netflix, which means it's pretty much accessible to everybody. I feel like there's going to be large crowds that don't take to this and probably won't even make it that far. Like, I'll be surprised if a lot of the people that just see a new option on Netflix and go with it, not really knowing who Charlie Kaufman is or what his style is, they'll be lucky if they make it 15 minutes probably because it's like just the way that it's made where it's instantly sort of off-putting, but off-putting in the way it's kind of supposed to be, where it's particularly in the editing where it's like you have the two of because obviously the concept being we have Jesse Plemons and Jesse Buckley in a car and they're going to his parents' house and they've only been dating for like a few weeks, and then it gets weird. Like that's basically the that's basically the basic plot outline before it goes into that. But we'll go into allegories and all that stuff. But it's to a degree. I don't really want to make this like a spoilery kind of video. Even I have done that before, but so this video isn't 5 hours. I figure we'll just kind of do the basis of it without going into like spoilery territory. But but as far as like that editing goes, where it's like there is a lot of cutting, there's a lot of setting things up. But especially in dialogue, you can tell because there'll be cases where like the dialogue will kind of overlap a little bit, but it's where like somebody will be talking and then before their sentence is when their sentence is like on the verge of finishing, the next person will start and kind of cut them off a little bit. And the end part of their sentence kind of trails off under the other person's voice, and it's like when you hear that described, it might sound like it's for like realism purposes, where it's like, oh, this is the way people talk, but no, it actually comes off really unnatural. Which, like I said, is the whole kind of thing is supposed to feel like sort of off balance, and like offsetting like that. So as far as going for that. It makes perfect sense, and also as far as editing goes, where the cuts are like really really abrupt, where it's like somebody will be talking and it'll cut to either a different scene or some time has passed, and it's like the dialogue almost never breaks from in between the cut, and it's like I said, it feels really weird just from the get go, before anything like weird is technically happening. So there's that. And we do have a very good cast here as far as the main like four go. It's pretty much perfectly cast. I will say that I don't know that I have warmed up to Jessie Buckley just yet in the way that a lot of people have. And it's not that I dislike her or anything. It's just I haven't really. I've just really felt no real connection to any time I've seen her on screen up to this point. But I feel like it's inevitable, certainly. But the thing also is that this is... I'm a little disappointed that I didn't get that here completely, because the role itself... And maybe this helps in the book because it's like from the first-person perspective in the book, but it's like... The, the way the character is like so anxiety-driven can make it like really relatable to probably just about anybody, because it's like the whole thing where you can imagine going into it if you just hear the plot, and know the kind of direction that it goes in as far as like its style. You can probably get the sense of she's going to meet the parents of this guy that she's actually not only has she not known for very long, but is already planning on breaking up with. So, like, you can imagine, like, it's going to be a bunch of allegories on just the anxiety of that. Anything that's, like, almost horror-like will be, like, intentionally exaggerated things to sort of bring that emotion out in a more visceral way. Like, we've seen a lot with stuff like The Babadook, where it's, like, or even Aronofsky's Mother, where it's, like, it's set up as you could if you wanted to just see it as like a very surface level horror thing, but there's obviously like the whole representation of different emotions or troubles or whatever, and it's just portraying it in this really visceral way by making a horror element out of it to represent whatever it is that you're like have a deep-seated fear of or whatever. or almost like a subconscious like reaction to. And so yeah, so there's that. But also we have Jesse Plemons' performance as well being the other key factor here. And what's really great about him is that obviously when you think Jesse Plemons, probably the first thing you think of is Todd in Breaking Bad, who is probably one of the most unsettling characters ever created, in just that way. But there's also like a certain charm that he can evoke really easily. So it's like, and he really plays into both of those, like as much as he possibly can, back and forth through this whole thing, which is really great at kind of setting that tone also. Where he can be like really charming, like there's a point in time where he's just rattling off the names of musicals. That's really good. But then there'll be cases where he can just snap at a moment's notice, seemingly totally uncharacteristic, kind of out of nowhere. And then sometimes in the physicality, like there's it's actually the book kind of draws a lot of attention to it. The way that he walks. If I remember correctly, the movie doesn't really address it out loud. We just kind of see like that's the way he walks around his parents' house, and there's just something so like stiff and off about it. And it's like just so all of those aspects he's hitting perfectly. He's another case where it was really just a case of perfect casting. On top of his parents being Tony Collette and David Thewlis, of course. So, and yeah, I suppose we can go into them because it was actually kind of jarring because the parents come in a lot earlier in the movie than they do the book. Like they come in like they get to the house like halfway into the book, and the movie is 2 hours and 14 minutes, and they're at the house like 20 minutes in. But Kaufman did a lot more with this house sequence and kind of expanded on it from what it is in the book. And like I said, I love that he did that, but there's also a certain feel here that I'm kind of missing. Like I said, I do wonder greatly, like obviously this is very much a perspective of this is the book and this is the movie, but I do wonder a lot about the perspective of a viewer that has not read the book and how they are taking all of this in, and how they're feeling about it. Because having read the book, there was something jarring about them getting to the house so quickly because there was so much. The entire first half of the book is build up and her anxiety building and building in regards to them getting to the house and exactly how it's going to go. And obviously the conversations are much more like because a lot of the book is the conversations because we have the whole build up to where it's halfway through before they even get to the house, and then we have after the fact when it continues, and so there's a lot of just the two of them talking in the car. And while reading the book, you might think it's going to be tough to make this cinematic. And like how are they going to do that? And I do think it's one of the troubles the movie has, kind of trying to translate that, where it's not necessarily just that it's just two of them talking in the car, because you can easily make that something. Obviously, the movie Lock is just Tom Hardy by himself in a car, and they totally made that work. But here, it's you can tell that the conversations are intentionally pretentious because that's the characters. That's just the way they are and the way they talk to each other. Particularly Jake, the Plemons character. So it's like, how do you really do that? And it's like, while I could see them being able to make it work, there's a point in time in the movie where Jessie Buckley has a long, long monologue where she's just analyzing A Woman Under the Influence, the Cassavetes movie. And even though A Woman Under the Influence is a movie that I like, even though she's really kind of bashing it, I just got really, really sort of unengaged in this second part. And it's like I was watching it, it was like, I really feel like I could be into this the way I was while reading the book, with the conversations there. But I don't know, because I think that's something more or less that Kaufman completely adopted. Was I feel like most, if not all, of the conversations in the car are totally different conversations that he just conjured himself rather than taking the conversations from the book. But I feel like the conversations in the book were much more sort of weirdly engaging in this kind of surreal way. Like I said, there may be a huge advantage of the book being from the first person perspective, so it kind of gives you much more of a mindset. But I don't know. I just wish it worked for me more than it did. But let's talk about this centerpiece when they actually are at the house with Toni Collette and David Thewlis. Where there's definitely some unsettling moments in the book, a couple of which I wish were still in the movie, but they're not. Um, that kind of give it a much more eerie atmosphere. But Kaufman just really, really took off with this thing. I don't want to necessarily say too much of what actually happens, but it's like the way this centerpiece scene when they're in the house like builds and builds and builds into this really weird. I don't want to say dreamlike, but I don't want to say nightmarish either. It's somewhere in the middle of that. I don't know how else to describe it. But you're not really sure what's going to be around the next corner. And it's so, and they kind of, there's a way you can kind of put together by the end what exactly is going on in this scene, or what it's supposed to signify at least. But I actually kind of like it just totally unexplained. Like, I feel like it's better that way, when you just see it as, like, totally surreal and unexplainable. And I just love the way you had no idea what the next scene in the house was going to be. And it's actually, Kaufman portrayed it much better than I would have thought, anybody could. Even though he's obviously a really talented filmmaker, I still kind of struggle to think you could really portray this well by basically seeing it from her perspective without it being too like reactionary. Because like if you had like a normal lead character that was just witnessing this stuff, it would be very overblown reactions of what is going on and why is this happening. But I guess this is where Buckley's strength comes in, where it's you can see like you do in a dream, like when you're having a dream and outlandish things are happening, but it's not until you wake up that you realize it was like weird. So it's like you just kind of accept things when you're in a dream, no matter how weird they are. And that's what it kind of feels like she's doing. So that whole thing, that was a really great sequence there. As far as like the real showpiece of it is the dinner scene, and I do think the dinner scene is good, and everybody's like all the actors are great here, obviously, but there was still like I still like some of the moments were a bit too like almost feel very manufactured in hey like drawing attention to stuff like hey this is the part that's supposed to be really weird when this character does this or that character does that thing. So like with that being a little more downplayed would have probably been more of a benefit to the dinner scene, but for the most part it really does work. So there's that. Really weird dinner scenes are becoming Toni Collette's thing, so we can trust her with that. And just kind of being really weird and off-putting in both blatant and subtle ways in general is pretty much what Toni Collette's doing here entirely. And David Thewlis has a lot of like really bizarrely funny moments throughout this scene, whether it be he's like he has this hatred for Billy Crystal that gets brought up. They're talking about the possibility of Buckley and Plemons sharing his childhood bed for the night, and he just, in this very gentlemanly way, says to Buckley, my wife and I, we have nothing against, that kind of thing, fucking and whatnot. And just just the way he said that in such a David Thewlis gentlemanly delivery was perfect. And there are moments like that throughout that are just, like, sort of unexpectedly funny. And sometimes, and a lot of the times, like, they land when the mood hits you just right. But there's other times where it's a little too blatant, and sometimes nonsensical, but not in the way the movie is. Not nonsensical in the way the movie does well. Like, there's a dig, I guess, at Robert Zemeckis in the middle of it. When one of the characters is watching this really, cheesy romance movie or something, and then we go, like, inside the movie, and then it ends, and it says directed by Robert Zemeckis. I don't know what that means, because Robert Zemeckis doesn't make like cheesy romance movies, like Hallmark movies like that. So I don't know what the joke is unless maybe it's an in joke like between them, or maybe it's like just in general saying Zemeckis' movies are cheesy or something. I don't know. But that was weird. So I don't know. But I guess if we're saying that, then it suits the movie. So there's that. Um, and then there is what else was I gonna say? Oh, there's a sequence also in the book that's really great, and I was really excited to see how it was going to translate to screen. Really, like a lot of the second half of the book was like that, where it's like you can see it so vividly. Like it almost feels like the images are weirdly vague yet so vivid at the same. It's hard to describe. Like I said, I guess you could say that's part of the dreamlike atmosphere, where something's like vague but vivid at the same time. And there's a sequence in the book where they go to Dairy Queen, and it just gets really, it's really off-putting because they're like out in the middle of nowhere, and she's talking about how the lights in particular feel like really unwelcoming. Um, Now, of course, for obvious movie reasons, the in the movie it's like a Dairy Queen knockoff, or like they clearly have like blizzards where they show that they turn them upside down and stuff like that. But it's like a knockoff name that Coffin came up with. There's like a whole advertisement for it and a theme song for it and everything. I think it's fictional. It's certainly something I've never heard of, but it definitely they were going for the blizzard thing for sure. Um, but in the book, it's he wants to get a blizzard from Dairy Queen, but what's missing here, and like I said, I guess technically this probably isn't the movie's fault because there's a whole, using brand names and all that's a complicated thing. But in the book, what really made that stand out was the familiarity we all have with Dairy Queen specifically. And like the fact that it's just some random knockoff place in the movie doesn't quite give it that feel to where it feels extra weird for it to feel like you're having this surreal experience at a place that you know and recognize that's just a normal place in any other reality. So I felt like that didn't quite carry the punch when it's not specifically. I know it's like I'm basically begging for product placement, but no, I thought that was really effective in the book. But yeah, that's gonna movies have to movie sometimes. Even Charlie Kaufman movies have to go by movie rules. So there's that. So I thought that was kind of missing, but. Um, yeah, so talking about the whole allegorical aspect without saying too much, there is an interesting sort of we're talking about like horror, like evoking like or being like an allegory for certain emotions or feelings or whatever, deep seated or otherwise. Where obviously, like I was talking about, anxiety seems to be a really big factor, especially through Buckley's character. But it's like there's at some point it feels like there's a maybe not an entire shift, maybe it comes in and out depending on how you see certain scenes, but there seems to be a shift from there's an underlying fear to like an underlying sadness as we kind of get to certain portions, and it's very very abstract, so I guess people will feel what they feel, but yeah, there was something in the book where I felt like I said, everything was so vivid that I was genuinely really creeped out a lot reading the book. That's not quite present here in the movie. Once again, that may just be having familiarity with the book kind of maybe softens the impact because to an extent, not entirely, somewhat of what to expect in the movie if you've read the book. So maybe that kind of deflates that a little bit. But like I said, Kaufman more or less went for possibly making up for that by, like I said, the entire last half an hour or 20 minutes or so are Kaufman going off way on his own thing. Just taking the inspiration that the book gave him and kind of shaping his own thing with what the book brought out of him in those last few pages or whatever. And yeah, and like I said, the book itself may explain a little too much, and it's like, because it's like a prime example of like explaining too much is like the scene everybody hates at the very end of Psycho, when we see, you know, Norman Bates's mom's corpse and we see him come out and he's in the dress and the wig and all that, and the audience puts it together entirely. And that's satisfying for an audience to be able to put all the pieces together. But then that psychologist comes out and gives us like a 10-minute monologue explaining what we know. That's basically what the book ends up doing. It's just saying like, oh, you know, all that stuff you pretty much just figured out. You figured out all the symbolism, the allegories, and all that stuff. Well, now we're gonna have this character that just explains exactly what you just saw and figured out for yourself. And Kaufman absolutely not only did not take that route, he went in the exact opposite direction. He went as abstract with it as he possibly could. Um, and so I certainly commend him for that, but like I said, I don't know that it entirely works, but at the same time, it almost feels like when you know it's like a filmmaker took the ending of this book that's meant to be interpreted and made this, it's almost like it's got to be something that's like deeply personal in a way. So it's like maybe there'll be certain, obviously if you know what's going on like in the book, there'll be certain things you can pinpoint for sure. But there's other things that may be a bit more shrouded in mystery, and it's like maybe that's just something that's personal to Kaufman. We don't really know. That's the whole point of, you know, abstract and artists and all that, at the risk of sounding pretentious. So yeah, I can appreciate it to that extent, but like I said, I think it's just a case of there was so much in the book that did work for me in really specific ways, that I'm all for seeing it translated through another vision, but it's probably, unfortunately, maybe tainted by just how visceral a reaction I had reading the book. And more so here. But like I said, there are still cases here where I still feel like there's scenes that probably should work more than they do, but they're just not as engaging as they could be. Mostly the scenes with them in the car, but um, yeah. So yeah, a lot of like really mixed feelings, and I'm still kind of trying to put it together exactly how I feel about it, and but I do feel like it's one of those cases where like I like once it resonates, probably in like maybe a week or so, I'll probably want to say like, oh, we should come back to this, and then we'll talk about exactly what the spoilers are and all the different directions we can possibly take that once it's had like sort of a week to resonate. Because I'm sure um, I and anybody that gets all the way to the end of this movie will it's gonna stay in here, and you're gonna still be trying to kind of pick it apart and see what else you can find. So we'll see what happens. It's one of those movies that you just kind of have to see where, like maybe it's also one of those cases. Sometimes I feel that way about a movie, and then I realize that I just don't care, and it wasn't as engrossing as it might have seemed to be at the start. But I feel like Kaufman's a different case in that scenario, where there's always going to be something that you want to explore more, even if it's something that's sort of almost like in a vault inside his head, that you kind of desperately want to get into anyway. So, there's, like I said, Synecdoche, New York came out in what, 2008, and I'm pretty sure there are still people dissecting that movie that started dissecting it in 2008. So, yeah, 2007 or 2008, I can't quite remember, but it's one of those. So I'm just gonna leave this at this, I guess. And like I said, maybe we'll come back to it, or maybe in our group videos, it'll come up again, because I know Ashley's a huge Jesse Buckley fan, so surely he'll be checking this out. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. And the next, I can't quite remember what else is coming out, but we'll get to all that. So until whatever the next thing is, that's gonna be it for this.